We have Morten here, and we're very pleased to have him. Morten is a professor of religious studies at the University of Iowa, and he serves actually as the chairman of the religious studies department there. Dr. Schlütter is one of the leading authorities, as I said, on Chan in the Song Dynasty. So this was after the Tang Dynasty, and this is the Song Dynasty from about the 10th to the 12th century. And his focus has been on religious, economic, and social factors that contributed to the rapid growth of Chan, making Chan, our Chan, which is Zen in Japanese, the dominant monistic power in China at that time. So welcome, Morten. It's so nice to have you here.
Oh, thanks for having me. I love talking about this stuff, and I love hearing people's questions and comments. So thank you.
We thought we would start off, and we're always going to try to bring, the present meaning into the past. But we thought we'd start off, maybe you give us a sort of an introduction to the Song Dynasty, or what, as an outsider in a sense, or as a non-affiliated scholar, a Western historian in really the best sense. Could you take us through a little bit of the time period that we might be talking about here?
Sure. I'll be happy to do that. If you don't mind, I'd like to say a few things about myself.
Sure.
Just because, first of all, I'm from Denmark, country in Europe. I used to teach in Wisconsin, and when I said I was from Denmark, people say, "Oh yeah, that's a really nice town. My sister lives there." But anyway, so if I speak funny or say things that sound ungrammatical or something, that's because even though I lived in the U.S. for many, many years, I'm not a native speaker. I'm a scholar, right? Unlike most of the people you had here, I'm not a Zen master. I can't claim any sort of Zen insights. But I have participated in a number of sessions. I was in session with Sasaki Roshi once, or Daijo Lori at the San Francisco Zen Center. Also, I can see Ann Dutton is here. We sat together at the New Haven Zen Center for a number of years, and so I have some experience, right? Even though I would not call myself a Buddhist, really. So you're asking about sort of taking you through some basics of Chan. So of course I should also make clear that my area of study is Chinese Chan Buddhism. It's not really Zen. So I did write a book called How Zen Became Zen, but that was really mainly because the publisher says, "Oh, you got to have Zen in the title because people buy it if it doesn't have Zen. People don't know what Chan is." And so then I came up with How Zen Became Zen. She was like, "Oh wow, Zen twice in the title. That's really good. We're gonna see some really good sales." So anyway, so I justify it by saying that we use Zen as a sort of moniker for the whole tradition in East Asia, right? And so we can use it in some sense, and when we talk about China too, simply because that's become the word used in the Western world. But what I really study is Chan Buddhism, and so Chan Buddhism started, in the 700s, probably back in China. We have some very interesting early works that only have come to light in recent times because they were lost in China, but then found in this cave in Western China called Dunhuang. So we're very lucky. We got a lot of interesting materials that tells us about the early formation of Chan Buddhism from that time. And so we know that there was this sort of emerging idea of a lineage, right? A very special lineage going back to this Indian guy known as Bodhidharma, who had a lineage that came directly from the Buddha through single so-called patriarchs in each generation, and came to Bodhidharma as the 30th, who then traveled to China, from India to China with it, and then found disciples in China. And of course, the story eventually goes on to the sixth patriarch, Huineng. Many of you probably know about Huineng, right? Because he's understood to be sort of the father of the whole subsequent Chan tradition. And so Huineng is special because until the sixth patriarch in China, there's only one person per generation. So there's no proliferation. It's just like kind of string of pearls, sometimes referred to, John McRae calls it that, or like a paper kind of thing. It's like you're the Pope, right? And then there can only be one at a time. But then after Huinong, it branches out. And then so today we have this very, complex branched out Zen lineage, like this very complex family tree that, of course exists in China, but also now in Japan and Korea and in Vietnam, and now in the Western world as well. So it all goes back to Huinong, and from Huinong to Bodhidharma, and Bodhidharma to the Buddha. Of course, we don't have to take that as history, right? I'm a historian, but what it tells us is this idea that only an enlightened person can really recognize enlightenment in someone else, and so you have to have this sort of sanction of someone who's been there themselves, so to speak. So lineage is, in my mind, the thing that really defines what Chan and Zen is, because if you only look at teachings, you can find teachings that are similar to many of the teachings you would find in a Chan text in other outside of the Chan lineage. But you only see that lineage, that specific sort of lineage in Zen Chan. Early on, very early on, that lineage, again, that was not really unique to Chan, but the emphasis was on emptiness and Buddha nature, those two teachings, right? And so I had a discussion once. I was talking to Bob Scharf. Many of you probably heard of him, a very eminent scholar of Zen and Chan. And he was saying, well, there are two really contradictory teachings. I mean, you can't both have Buddha nature and emptiness, but that's, of course, not how it understood, right? That in many ways, the no we just talked about, maybe that's to be understood as a kind of expression of emptiness, right? And so the emptiness of all thing and the ultimate Buddha nature of all sentient beings can be seen as perhaps the same. Yeah, I don't know how much detail to go into, but from Huinong, you go into the Tang Dynasty, and we have some various famous figures like Matsu, who's many of you probably have heard about, who was this, this sort of erratic figure who was shouting at people and even hitting them and things like that. And then from the Tang, we eventually move into the Song Dynasty, which is sort of my period. And the Song Dynasty is special because, because I love this period, it's so interesting, but we had sources from the Song Dynasty that's actually contemporary. So we don't really have that for the Tang. So
yeah.
Very few.
May I read something from your book? You say
Absolutely.
that it's still widespread perception that Chan, together with Chinese Buddhism, lost its true spirit after the Tang Dynasty, and that Chan in particular had its golden age in that Tang Dynasty in the 8th and 9th centuries, surviving later ages only on wistful memories of the great masters of the past. I like that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, right. It's so long ago I wrote that book that I could not have found that quote easily. But yes. But the truth is that the image we have of this great period of the golden age of Zen or Chan in the Tang Dynasty is really one that comes to us from the Song Dynasty. All the sources, or almost all the sources we have, are actually much later than the Tang itself, right? But again, when I teach this to my students, I often say, as historians, we like to sort of uncover what happened and what's mythical and what may not be. But what's really important in the tradition is that the Tang Dynasty was seen as this golden age, right? And all the great koans are basically attributed originally to Tang masters, right?
Right.
So talk about having Buddha nature, for example.
I've got a question about the Tang monasteries. Sure. If you look at Kolkai, for example, when he writes about the 5 mountains, right. he's got these maps of these ancient Chinese, these Tang Dynasty monasteries, and they have their meditation room, but many of them are tiandai. So was there actually, in your mind, were there actually dedicated Tang monastery or Chan monasteries in the Tang period?
I don't really think so. I mean, the one important difference between Chinese Buddhism in general and Japanese Buddhism is that Chinese Buddhism was never really sectarian. So they were never really, in Japanese Buddhism, you have these very specific, so a temple belongs to a particular sect of Buddhism, right? And that sect will have its own system of ordination, of liturgy, and so on. But in China, you don't really have that. Everything is just Buddhism, right? Mm-hmm. And so temples are really just Buddhist temples. And so what you see in the song is that some temples get sort of like a kind of Chan designation, but it's not like it's a kind of temporary thing because there's a Chan master sitting there, and a Chan master is really just part of the Buddhist community. So, in the song, we do see some sort of like identification of Chan as a lineage within Buddhism, right? Um, it's not so clear that that was as visible in the Tang, right? So they might just have been looked upon as these interesting, Buddhist masters who, like Matsu and so on, who did interesting things and maybe said some odd things too. But there was not the same sense of like a grouping that we sort of see as Chan as specific to other Buddhism. At least that's my impression. But again, because of the sources and so on, we don't have a full image of exactly how it was organized in the Tang.
And can we look at Song Dynasty monasteries now? They're quite large. It's like 1,500 people, 1,700 people.
Somewhere, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, probably, yeah, sorry.
No, and that movement, that whole movement you talk about of going from private to public, converting from private to public, the tonsur monasteries into the public monasteries, and how that, to some degree, that cost Chan its independence, right?
Well, yes, but it also made it very powerful. It made it grow, right? So, for those of you in the audience who haven't read my book, and I really wouldn't blame you if you haven't, one of the things I talk about in the book is how there was this sort of distinction in the song between public monasteries and private monasteries. And so private monasteries were no doubt by far the most numerous ones, right? And they were typically smaller monasteries, and they were kind of in principle owned by the monks who lived there. And so those monks would have disciples, but they were not based on some sort of special transmission like in Chan, but it was based on who had tonsured them. So a master who tonsured disciples, meaning sort of inducted them into the Buddhist order as monastics, they would become the heirs to the temple eventually. Right?
It's largely just a seniority system, right?
Right. And everybody would start there because you could not really, it seems you could not get tonsured at the public monasteries. So the public monasteries became these sort of large institutions that where monks could, stay for a long time, but also often it seems would come through and stay for, a shorter period. And that often have big land grants. So they were sort of given land so they would get income, like rental income from land farmed by peasants and so on. And so the public monasteries were understood by the Song state to be important because they were seen as directly sort of under the state. And so, for example, one of the main tasks of an abbot in a public monastery was to perform services for the welfare of the state and the long life of the emperor. So that was like a standard ritual. It's performed every single day.
Yeah, you mentioned in the book that, and I hadn't considered this before I read it, but that officials liked having a monastery nearby, not because they were practicing, but they thought it was good luck or that it brought some sort of something positive to the community. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, we see that, of course, in many sort of religious traditions, right? That there's a sort of aura around. I remember knowing someone who the Pope, the Catholic Pope, was on TV, and she wanted her baby to see the Pope on TV. The idea that somehow the baby would be blessed. Of course, the baby had no idea what she's seeing, right? But just holding the baby up in front of the TV screen, and that somehow. So that sort of charisma associated with figures and buildings too, right? Why do we have these huge cathedrals, right? They have this aura emanating from them, and so large public monasteries clearly were seen as these sort of forces that was attracting good to a place. I think I have an example in my book, if I remember correctly, of a text that talks about how the weather is becoming better because there's a big monastery, the public monastery being built there, established there. So there's no doubt that they were seen as, in a very real way, right? They were seen as sort of these sources of positive power, also for the empire. There's no doubt that for the emperor, having, all these temples, all these monasteries pray for his long life. I mean, that had a real effect. I mean, the idea is that this really works, that this really will help. And of course, who doesn't want to live long? So it'd be nice to have, hundreds of monasteries pray for your long life across the country every day.
So there was in 955 there was somebody who an emperor came in, started the Song Dynasty, or it was the end of the 5 dynasties or something. He came in and he wanted to close down 30,000 monasteries. There's 30,000 monasteries, and then only 3,000, I guess, had the protection of the state. They had some certificate or something that would protect them.
Yeah, so the system of public monasteries is not entirely clear when exactly it was instituted and how exactly it came about, but they're basically, so the idea is there are monasteries that are kind of supported by the state, and so the state would also, we got away from that a little bit, right? But what happened in the Song, that the state would convert by decree larger private monasteries into public. So basically, I mean, pretty serious thing, because it would mean that the monks who originally lived there would kind of lose their rights to it. So it was a sort of land grab or whatever, temple grab by the state, right? But it would then mean that this would become sort of under the direct control of the state. And then basically forces of the state would be the ones who decided who were to lead those monasteries. And so this really helped the Chan tradition spread, because Chan masters were most often the ones who were appointed to these monasteries, right? So the Chan school, the Chan lineage, I should say, became sort of associated with those public monasteries, and that really enabled Chan to grow tremendously in the Song Dynasty. Right?
Yeah, well, you say the success of a Chan master and his lineage was to a large degree dependent on his ability and willingness to participate in literati culture, right? So he had to be a literati, essentially.
Right.
And as a Chan master whose writing, conversation, or demeanor lacked appeal for the literati, had little chance of success.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's that I believe that's very true, right? That and there are some interesting comments I came across. I don't know how many of them are in my book, but where someone was like, just not really making it as a Zen master, because he doesn't have the right connections, right? He didn't know the literati who could, help him get appointed to a position in a public monastery. And as we talked about before we opened it up to the whole group, it was really crucial for a Chan master, a Zen master, to be receiving an appointment to a public monastery, because only in that position would he, almost always he, be able to transmit his lineage. So there's this similar. It's very similar to I was saying, right, to having a PhD. If you have a PhD, you still can't confer a PhD to someone else unless you have a position in a PhD granting institution, right? And so it seems to be the same thing in the Song, that you had to be having a position in a monastery, in a public monastery, in order to carry on your lineage. So it's really crucial, right? It was not just a matter of prestige or power or whatever. It was simply like, can you carry on your lineage or not? So getting that position was absolutely crucial. Not everybody had what you would say, the right connections or the right kind of personalities to be successful in doing that.
And where, people like Dali, who we'll talk about later, and Hong Tzu, they came into their tonsure, became monks at 11 or 16 years old, whatever. Where did they get their education that they could then rise to be highly educated individuals and be able to interface with these literati so successfully?
Yeah, no, that's actually an interesting question. Now, because we often don't have too much information about the family background of famous monastics. But for example, Hongzhi clearly came from a literati family himself. Like Hongzhi is this guy we might be talking about later, who's a proponent of what we know now as silent illumination. And he could already read and write and could recite text when he was 5 years old. The story goes, and it's kind of believable, right? So many of those famous monastics, famous monks, who became Zen masters probably already as children were schooled in the literati sort of environment, and learned to read and write very early on in their lives. And so they probably had quite a lot of education even before they became monastics, but then they probably also, again, this is really guesswork because we don't know that much about it, but there probably was a difference between private monasteries. It's clear that many monastics in some of the private monasteries were hardly literate at all, right? So it's certainly not everybody who was a monk or a nun. And we have to remember there were also nuns in China. It's one of the few places where you actually had a tradition of fully ordained nuns that has been, going on up till this day.